do introductions. We'll introduce ourselves, and then maybe you all can say where you're from and in the world right now.
Awesome. So we are here with Climate Generation, a Well-Steger Legacy. My name is Megan, and I'm the Education Coordinator at Climate Generation, and we're based in Minneapolis, Minnesota.
I'm Kristen Poppleton, and I'm the Director of Programs at Climate Generation, and I am based right now in St. Paul, Minnesota, which is across the river.
Hey everyone, and this is Sarah Goodspeed. I am our Youth and Policy Manager, and I'm calling in from Madrid, Spain, and I'm at our place right now because it was really loud at the COP event yesterday on our webinar, so I came back to our room. We're staying with a family about a mile away, so we're in their daughter's room.
That's awesome.
Wabasha Kellogg.
Sure. Yeah, you mean do that. We just.
So we are from Wabasha Kellogg in Wabasha, Minnesota, and this is a junior and senior class titled Earth Climate.
Mm-hmm.
For joining us.
Awesome. And I have a classroom of mostly 6th, but some 8th graders also. We're in Baltimore, Maryland. Do you guys want to give a wave? Yeah. Hello. And I teach climate change and teach about the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change as part of our 6th grade science curriculum, which is kind of geared towards climate action. And we are just getting started. So, but my 8th graders do remember because they participated in the World Climate Simulation. So Sarah Goodspeed up in the upper right-hand corner, she's at the actual convention that you simulated. So, and 6th graders, we will be doing that next month.
You want to pop up the slides, Megan?
Yeah.
Lucy, just close the door behind you.
So our plan was to share a little bit about COP, or the COP, as I heard some people calling it, and then just have discussion. And if you all too from Minnesota to Maryland want to connect at all and ask each other questions, that's always a cool opportunity, I think. So yeah. So we already kind of ran through these questions. So as Sarah said, she's broadcasting in from Madrid, Spain. She's there with 3 other people from our organization, representing our organization at these big high-level United Nations sponsored meetings. And so the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is this big, huge, overarching framework that was put in place to help the world make decisions on how they were going to deal with climate change. And so almost 200 countries, or they call them parties in this instance, almost 200 countries of the world came together and said, climate change is a really big deal and we want to do something about this. And this was about 25 years ago that they did this. And so since that time, they've been working on figuring out how the heck they're going to address this big problem. And so they've done a number of different things. One of the important things that happens with this big, huge United Nations framework is they put on a conference every year called the COP, which is the Conference of Parties. And as I said, those parties are the conference of all the countries that are making decisions about climate change. And what's really cool about these meetings is that the big, huge, important, elected officials and ministers and presidents, heads of state, as they call them, they're all invited to this meeting to have discussions, but also invited are people who are observers from nonprofits and from businesses and from the media, young people, and those people are all there to learn, but also to make sure that the heads of state are listening to what's important and remembering that when they make decisions, they're impacting real life people. And so our organization, Climate Generation, is able to attend these meetings. You have to go through this super official process called accreditation. And they tell us every year how many people we get to send. So this year they said we could send 4 people per week. And we were really conscious that we wanted to make sure we were sending people that could learn a lot from this and also raise important issues. And so Sarah works with all of the youth in our organization, and we really wanted to make sure that young people's voices were being heard. We also sent a young person who is reminding them. We sent someone named Eric who makes decisions about how we plan cities and metro areas, and that's really important work about how we're responding to climate change. And then we sent a woman named Jen who works in water, because water issues are becoming more and more important too. What's the next slide? So Sarah had put together, I think I'll let her kind of talk these things through because she was there, put together some pictures that really kind of show the kinds of things that happen at the COP from this week so far.
Yeah, thank you. So I threw some photos together just from the last couple of days, just because there's so much that happens inside, and I wanted to give you all a glimpse of what happens at the COP, and so you can get a sense of the different kind of conversations and people that we get to meet at these events. And so on the first slide, we have some photos just of the different kinds of events that happen inside. So something that's really common is the first photo is just a panel. And so there are panels throughout the day, probably 20 at any given time. There are like 6 massive buildings about the size of a football field, and each of them have smaller meeting rooms like the ones in the photos. And so there are events in every single room throughout the day. So this first panel I attended was by the IPCC. So they have a whole room where they bring the different scientists who have contributed to reports that they put out about climate change. And so this particular panel was about women in science. And so a lot of women who do research about climate change and how other women can get into the field of science and what kind of work they are able to do, and the importance of those different perspectives that we bring from having different genders and the different roles that plays out in the field of science. And then the next photo on the top right was really exciting. It was a huge room filled with about 100 people around a giant round table. And the woman in the center in the background is the president of the COP. So it's Carolina Schmidt is the Minister of Environment from Chile. So even though we're in Madrid right now, it was originally supposed to be held in Chile. And so their country still holds the presidency of COP, which means that they set the agenda and they help get to be in charge of the order of who speaks and what different events and issues are prioritized. And then the woman in the foreground in the floral shirt is a representative from the Indigenous peoples organizations. And so every different audience, like we're from environmental organizations, there are research organizations and business organizations. And so she was speaking directly to the president from Indigenous peoples' perspectives on things that they're pushing for COP negotiations to do. And in the bottom left is a smaller group. So we had, if we go back again, so this is just US delegates who got to meet with our chief negotiator. And so the US is able to we had about, I'd say, 40 different nonprofits who work in the environmental field. And we were telling the chief negotiator for the United States on what are the important things that we expect the United States to be bringing forward and representing on our behalf. And so it was really exciting to be able to speak directly with her, who's a diplomat and represents the United States government in these negotiations. So we had a direct channel to help influence that. And then in the bottom right, you can see another panel. This was a press conference, and Greta Thunberg was on that panel. And it was really about how we're uniting behind the science that shows us how urgent climate change is.
Cool. It looks like we just had another person join. Can you hear us, Amber?
You're mute. She's muted.
Yeah, I'm trying to unmute her.
It's on her end.
Um,
Or write in the chat. Say, hey, you can hear us.
Hi, Amber. Well, I'll just share a little more about the next slide of photos. The coolest part about this conference is that it brings together people from around the whole world. And so this photo is just a few of the different folks that we've met and heard from, and the different perspectives that they bring forward from different regions. And even though we're not directly in negotiations all the time, some of us are able to sit in and observe. But the most exciting part is being part of those side events and actually getting to speak with different people about what brings us to COP and what brings us together united to take action on climate change. And so there was an amazing panel of Indigenous women and women of color at the front lines of climate action. And in the bottom is another panel about women in renewable energy. Also, in the other bottom corner is a man from Chile who was talking about youth and leadership with education that they were doing there. And so it was just so exciting to hear from all these different perspectives about the incredible work that people are taking across the world. And I think some of the most interesting stuff is that it's not like it's a lot of similar action that we're all taking, and it plays out in our different contexts and our different cultures, but we're all working towards the same goals. And so that's really exciting to connect with people who are passionate about the same things. And then because I'm our youth and policy manager at Climate Generation, I've had a particularly strong passion to follow the youth voices here at COP. And it's been incredible the way that youth have really stepped into their power and are stepping into leadership at these negotiations. In the first picture, it's youth after a press conference from Fridays for Future, Indigenous youth from Sustain Us. And this was after a press conference where Greta Thunberg ceded her entire speaking time to all these other youth from around the world, so that that all the press who were there to see her really heard the voices of all of her peers who are also amazing, amazing climate leaders. And so the youth have shown incredible solidarity. And I was able to attend the Youth Sustain Us breakout session where we sang songs and told stories and really got to share how important it is that we're all uniting for climate action and uniting around frontline communities. And youth have also been helping with actions outside of COP. And so outside of the venue in the bottom left, you can see that the Extinction Rebellion held a sit-in in the street. And so there are also a lot of protests and other actions and rallies all around this event. Some are allowed in, some are kept outside. And we'll also show you a video in a bit about an action that was inside and kicked outside, but there's a lot of folks that are just really speaking out and calling for more action, since here we're almost at the end of our 2 weeks and we're not seeing the progress that we were really hoping to see. So related to that, in the bottom right corner, you can see is the Fossil of the Day ceremony, which is really fun. That's done every day by the Climate Action Network, which is an international network of environmental advocacy groups. And every day they announce some countries who are doing, they call it doing the best at being the worst. So these are countries who are trying to stall negotiations and prevent progress from climate action. And on that particular day, the United States was recognized for impeding progress, and they have been a couple of times. So that's been exciting to be here as a citizen of the United States and someone who's trying to speak directly with our negotiators, for them to really step up and take the leadership that we need of them.
Awesome.
So this next slide, I wanted to ask you all that are watching now in the 2 classrooms about this. So as Sarah mentioned, youth, so young people that are your age or even younger, the young woman, the girl in the far left there in this photo is 8 years old. She's from India. Youth voices are something that has been really elevated at the COP, as far as at least putting them up on stage to hear from them. I don't know that it means that they're listening and putting what they're saying into the documents that are official and important. But 2 days ago, the conference, one of the big themes was talking about the important part that education plays in making sure that people know about climate change and they're doing something about climate change. And one of the older men that spoke said that when it comes to education, youth are reversing the education pyramid, meaning instead of the old people teaching young people, that young people are the ones teaching their parents and grandparents. So I'm wondering what you all think about that. Does that make you mad? Does that make you, do you agree with that? What do you think about that?
Interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of a different time, so.
Yeah, Kat. Nice and loud.
It really depends on like.
What? It really depends on. Do you want me to move this out of the way? No? Okay. Any other thoughts from Baltimore? What do you think? What do you think, Lynn?
I think it's kind of shocking that it's come to the point where youth are teaching adults.
Good point. Shocking that you have to. Yeah. You all are so chatty usually. What's going on?
It's a big question.
It is a big question.
Well, I'm kind of proud of us. Yeah, you're teaching everyone, and teaching all the people who should be helpful and skating and stuff. But this is also bringing the youth are really determined now to speak out, and some youth are shouting.
Mm-hmm. Can you guys hear us okay?
Can you repeat that?
Yes.
Can you?
That, and correct me if I miss a part, but that, you know, it's kind of shocking that that youth have to kind of be the ones doing the educating, but also it's kind of that you're proud. So you said you're kind of proud of the fact that youth are being given kind of a role, and that you know, they are kind of stepping up, even though, you know, it can be hard.
You should be proud.
Yeah, absolutely.
At least we're not teaching people how to eat.
At least we're not teaching people how to eat. What do you
Yes.
mean?
That's what it does.
Yeah.
Yeah. People like teach babies how to eat. At least we're
Okay.
not that far.
Like metaphorically.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Toddler skills.
Jason,
More about stuff we learn at school.
you say that again? Thanks
It's
a lot.
more about like things we learn at school, and we think are interesting and tell our parents.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, you are kind of the important conduit for communication from here to home, for sure.
Any thoughts from Wabasha Kellogg?
I guess I could probably tell like a personal like story because I know. So I talk with my mom a lot. I talk with her about just stuff like in a car ride or whatever. We'll just strike up a conversation about like news and stuff. And I know I've talked with her a lot about like climate change, news relating to it. And at first, you know, she was kind of like, I wouldn't really say skeptical, like she believed in it, but I believe the way she said it, she's like, well, you know, we don't really, you know, she didn't really know for sure whether or not it was like, you know what I mean, right? Like,
Yeah.
Like the specifics of it. But I think that I've talked with her a lot. You know, I've shown her a lot of the evidence that I was taught in this class and that I've seen in my own. And I think like I've kind of like it's kind of interesting to me that you know that a lot of adults are they're more like receptive to learning about it because I know that you know they're more open-minded about it because I don't know, it's kind of like it's you know, you kind of got that like stereotype that you know, oh well, they you know, the adults they don't want to listen, that sort of thing. And I think that you know it's kind of interesting to see that you know sometimes it's not exactly true. So I think that it's good. It's good because you know, I mean, I've talked to a lot of people in general about it, and people are actually surprisingly open-minded about learning about it. It's just that there's a lot of misconceptions. And so I like having that sort of reverse because then, you know, let me see how I want to say this. And I like having that inverse of like that pyramid that, you know, you're talking about where, you know, parents teach kids. Well, it's the other way around. You know, I think it's really interesting because a lot of, you know, it's kind of like that idea of, you know, kind of like that idea, you know, like, how do I want to say this?
Usually learn from our elders or, you know, the adults and
The wise.
the wise. They've experienced more. They've, you know, lived longer than us. They should have more to share, but the roles have been reversed on this situation.
It's exactly how it is.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, go ahead.
oh, okay. I was gonna say it's also kind of funny, like with the young people teaching their parents and grandparents, because everything, especially when my parents were kids and stuff, it was way simpler because now we have the internet and all this controversial things going on every single day. So I think it's kind of funny, especially like, and also just with the simple like trend dances or memes and stuff. It's just kind of funny that they don't know what it is, but we do. And
We don't just, I just had a conversation about memes the other day. It's funny because I totally get what they are and I think they're funny sometimes, but I don't have the deep visceral thing that you guys have for memes. So cool. It's cool. Well, I appreciate your thoughts. Those are really authentic and great. So thank you. We wanted to share with you one perspective too that kind of links to what we were talking about earlier for this whole focus this time, which is thinking about young people, but also thinking about young people in places around the world that are being more impacted by climate change. And Sarah's been getting to meet a lot of these people. And I know that some of you read some of the articles of looking at how climate change is making migration happen, so making people have to leave their homes because of sea level rising or it being too hot or not enough food. And some of you read Exodus. Did anyone read Exodus? Raise your hand if you read Exodus.
I've read Exodus.
You read Exodus?
Yeah.
Oh, nice. We have one person here.
Oh, awesome. So maybe we'll talk about Exodus a little bit in a second too, but Exodus also being not necessarily reality, but definitely giving us a window into what it feels like to have to leave your country or your home because of sea level rise or because something's pushing you there, and going to a place where your voice isn't necessarily being heard, that you don't have power. And so here is, we wanted to share 2 different videos just to show you how power plays out at the COP in different ways. And so this first one is just a young person from the Pacific Islands sharing his voice.
My home is only 2 meters above water. With the threats of climate change, we'd lose 2 meters of our culture, our Yahweh, our Manat, our Roro, our Pit, our language, 2 meters of our legends. This is why we created a Youth Leaders Coalition that has the youth create innovative ways to fight climate change and lobby them towards our leaders. A team of students came up with a new sustainable design for a seawall that our Minister of Environment, David Paul, has shown interest towards. This is why our youth should be more involved. When you are in trouble, you find new solutions to face it, and our youth has proven to do so. This is why I'm here, to represent them and their ideas, to be a part of the generation that's going to end the fight against climate change, to voice out the reality of the future that the Marshall Islands is facing, to tell you that we don't want to lose our only 2 meters. Thank you.
And you can see on the panel there on the right too is Greta Thunberg from Sweden, as well as some young people from around the world speaking. So youth at the COP are able to be on panels like this, speaking up and sharing it. So they're invited, but then as Sarah mentioned, and she can talk about this now herself, there's other ways that people try to get their voices heard. So Sarah, you want to talk about yesterday a little bit?
Sure. So yesterday there was a big rally inside the COP that was right outside where they were doing some very high level speeches. And so youth leaders started a sit-in with solidarity from a lot of adult organizations also present. And this video is actually from our own youth delegate, Sabrina, who was caught up in it because, well, you'll see for yourself, it was really powerful to hear hundreds of people who just sat down and were, you could hear them inside of the plenary where the officials were speaking. And they were frustrated because we haven't seen a lot of progress yet in negotiations. And so they wanted to make sure that they were heard. And you can see that there was a pretty scary response that a lot of officials weren't happy with people trying to speak out and trying to push for more progress. So we'll show the video here. Thank you. So as you can see, there were just hundreds of people who were sitting and holding space, and they were chanting and singing and really being heard, calling for action. And you also saw some police were in that video. And so shortly after that video was taken, they started taking those people and pushing them outside. So they got kicked out for having that action, but it was really powerful that they did that. And people were talking about it all the rest of the day.
Sorry, I was muted. Well, we wanted to give you all time, and Amber, if you can type in the chat to ask Sarah any questions or any comments that you have while you've got her in Madrid. She's still going to be there a couple more days. Something that you want her to investigate, find the answer to, you can task her with that, and she can get in touch later.
I'll write it all down. Give me my homework.
Any of you in here have any questions? Just raise your hand and I'll. Questions, comments, reflections? I know you're. All right, Marcus, speak loudly.
Was anyone arrested?
No one was arrested, fortunately, but they did get kicked out of the venue, and they weren't allowed back in until this morning.
What is the main solution for greenhouse gases?
Ooh, that's a really good question. So one of the main solutions that people here are working towards is to reduce carbon emissions. So that means stopping burning fossil fuels is really the biggest one. And then there are a lot of other solutions that can help, which includes like reforestation and regenerative sustainable agriculture and ways to keep our planet healthy using by supporting natural systems.
Anybody? Right, Kim?
I was kind of confused on why the people like started the riot outside and then came inside.
Can you explain a little bit more like what kind of the hope was for COP25 as far as like as far as the negotiations are concerned? I mean, I know like Article 6 from the Paris Agreement, but in like middle schooler terms, if there's a way to kind of simply talk about what that is. Sounded like that's not really making much progress right now.
Right. So the general overview is that out of this COP, we were really hoping to have the rules created for how countries are going to report their own reduction of emissions so that they could meet their goals. So we know that we cannot heat the planet more than 2 degrees Celsius. And really our goal is to not heat it over 1.5 degrees Celsius because that's what the youth was talking about would make the oceans rise so high. So in order to prevent the Earth from warming, we have to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And so countries are being tasked by having a plan to how they're going to reduce those emissions. And so at this COP, they're making the rules on how countries are going to report their progress. But a lot of countries don't agree on what those rules should be. So that kind of means like who gets a head start, who gets to double count their emissions. And so there's different ways that people can kind of cheat. Instead of really making emissions reductions, they kind of just want to cut corners. And so that's what a lot of the negotiations are sticking on. And that's preventing us from making progress in finalizing the rules so that countries can report their progress beginning next year. And so what a lot of the youth were protesting was that a lot of those countries are holding up progress by bickering over the rules instead of just committing to take action and committing to those reductions. And especially by increasing our commitments, because originally when they set those goals, it was for 2 degrees. And so they also want them to have more ambitious goals that would prevent the Earth from warming more than 1.5 degrees. So overall, like those are some of the technical goals for the COP. And the reason that youth started the protest and others partners in solidarity, hundreds of people protested because we're not making progress. And so they just wanted to really be heard that they need to do more and they need to come together and stop their bickering.
Thanks. We got a few questions from Mrs. Niemeyer's class prior to this, and Sarah, I might just ask you a few of those.
Sure.
One of them is, what are you most passionate about in the concept of climate change? And maybe has any of that kind of been brought forward this week?
Absolutely. Something that I'm the most passionate about is really being able to hear about how climate change is impacting communities directly. And so hearing those stories has been really incredible to hear from people all around the world around what they're doing in their own communities to build resilience and build compassion. So it's really about how are we helping one another who are being impacted by climate change.
Nice. Another one, maybe this relates to the students today, but were you exposed to climate change in middle school or in high school at all? Or when did you start learning about it in school?
That's a really great question. And actually I don't remember being taught about climate change in the classroom. So I'm really envious that you all are being taught it in your classroom and have awesome teachers with you today. But when I was growing up, Bill Clinton was president and Al Gore was vice president. And if you've heard of Al Gore, it's probably because of his work on climate change. And so that's how I heard about it, was through current events. So when I was in middle school, they signed the Kyoto Protocol, which was like the first time they tried to make a goal for reductions of greenhouse gas emissions. And so that was in the news a little bit, and that's how I first learned about climate change.
What has been the most surprising thing that you have encountered at the negotiations?
Ooh, the most surprising thing. I think the most surprising thing is that you'll just like run into like random important people. Like everyone's important, but sometimes you'll run into like a random like state official or a party delegate. And I know Kristen, when she went to COP, she met the president of Mozambique, and I haven't met any presidents yet, but I have met a lot of folks who are ministers of environment or of different roles in their own countries. And so folks who have really important roles in their own countries are just here side by side with everyday activists like me. So that's really exciting to be able to see how everyone can just sit down and talk to one another.
Awesome.
I think I'd just add too, I'm surprised that almost all of the events are being held in English, and that's really surprising for such an international event. Not only that so many of the participants do speak English and don't need translators, but also that they would pick English for an event for such an international community where there are so many other languages that are also spoken.
Yeah, good thought. Do we have any other questions that any of you students have thought of that you would like to ask Sarah?
We do have a couple, but I was curious because we are entering into their lunch period, and so they're getting a little curious if there was another, if it was wrapping up or if we're just doing Q&A and then there was something else. But we do have a couple more questions, but we might have to go in about 5 minutes if that's okay with you.
Yep, that was our plan. So if there's a, we're all done except for questions.
Thank you. Yeah. All right, Luca, nice and loud.
In a video I watched, it said that like in COP they were trying to put a price on carbon. Have you gotten anywhere with that?
That's great. I'm so glad that you're keeping up with the negotiations. So they have not decided on a price of carbon, but one thing that they are trying to do is open carbon markets. And so supposedly the market would set a price just based on economics. And so that would, in a sense, put a price on carbon, even though it's not necessarily a fixed price. But that's not agreed on yet on what that looks like. There are a lot of problems with the way that carbon markets have been rolled out in previous examples, and so we're trying to make sure they do better next time around so it doesn't have those same problems and impacts on communities.
What solutions has the COP accomplished in the last few years? What problems?
That's also a great question. And I might ask Kristen to help too, because she's followed it more over the last few years. The Paris Agreement was in 2015, was the absolute biggest thing to come out of the COPs. And so this is COP25. So they've been doing this for 25 years. And so every year there's just a little bit of progress towards like what we can do as a global community working together on climate change. And so it looks a little different from year to year. Kristen, do you have other thoughts?
I was going to say the Paris Agreement is definitely, because that agreement, the fact that so almost 200 countries of the world said that they would, they gave specific amounts of greenhouse gases that they would reduce in their countries. It's not enough, but they all said a specific amount that they were going to reduce, which is a really big deal. And for you all that did World Climate, you know exactly how hard it is to even figure that out, get to an agreement on those things in your little class even. I also, one thing that Sarah mentioned, which is actually a really big deal, when I was in Paris, so I got to go to the COP when it was in Paris, and the United Nations had forever just said that we wanted to not get the world warmer than 2 degrees warmer. And when I came there, I talked to some indigenous people from the Pacific Northwest, and they said, we're trying to get them to say that it should only be 1.5 degrees. And I had never heard that before, and I could not believe that anyone would ever agree to it because it was such a big deal. But when they wrote the Paris Agreement, they actually wrote into the Paris Agreement that their ultimate goal was 1.5 degrees. And the only reason they did that is because they listened to indigenous people and people on island nations who said, you have to do this or else our whole way of life is going to be destroyed. So that was an instance when they listened to people's voices and they really included it. And then I thought that was pretty remarkable.
So hopefully they'll keep listening to us this year again.
Right. There one last pressing question before we sign off, and Sarah gets to go to bed. It's her bedtime over there.
Any questions from Minnesota here?
When astronauts go to space, does it affect climate change anyway?
Ooh, that's a good question. You know, I bet rockets do give off greenhouse gas emissions, you know, like airplanes do. But once they're outside of the atmosphere, then those emissions aren't affecting our atmosphere. That's a really good question. I'd love to learn more about it. Let me know if you learn more.
Well, we really appreciate you all joining us. It was so fun to hear directly from students and teachers, and stay in touch and keep following, and we'll do this again next year. So every year we do this. I'd love for your questions and feedback. So
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.